Stay tuned. Ahead, I'll talk with Erika Robuck about The Last 12 Miles. This work of historical fiction tells the story of two real-life women on opposite sides of the law during the Prohibition Rum Wars in 1926. Hi, I'm Dan Skinner, and this is Some Books Considered. Erika Robuck is the national best-selling author of numerous works of historical fiction, including Sisters of Night and Fog, The Invisible Woman, and Hemingway's Girl. She joins us to talk about The Last 12 Miles. Erika, welcome to Some Books Considered.
Thank you for having me. I'm happy to be here.
Well, in the introduction to your book, you talk about the inspiration for this latest work of historical fiction. So tell us a bit about that.
Sure. I've been working on women and intelligence history for 2 books now, both in World War II history. And when I was at different events for these other women from World War II, I had 3 different people at 3 different events tell me, you really have to read about cryptanalyst Elizabeth Smith Friedman. Finally, by the time I got home from my travels and I was thinking about my next story, I look over and one of the people had given me a basket of gifts with French resistance jams and World War II paraphernalia. But tucked in the basket was a biography about Elizabeth Smith Friedman. And so I took that as a sign I should proceed. But just having come off of World War II, I didn't want to write that period again. And I became fascinated by Elizabeth Friedman's code breaking during the Prohibition years, nabbing rum runners and bootleggers.
So put this novel in perspective for us. Describe what was going on during that Prohibition Rum War.
Sure. So in the early days, it started out as a lot of small-time operators. The country was cracking down because the women's temperance movement was lamenting their drunken husbands and businesses falling apart. And a sort of mania swept the country with it. Laws got made, and all of a sudden it was illegal to purchase alcohol. You could drink it if you had it. There were different medicinal uses. The Catholic Church and Judaism could use it for different sacramentals and services, but you couldn't just go to a liquor store and buy it. So in the early days, it was sort of grandma got creative, started a still in the basement. And then in South Florida, people started realizing, well, the Bahamas and Cuba aren't very far, and it's legal until you get to a certain point in U.S. waters, and then you just have to get to shore real fast, and then you can sell it and make a nice profit. And that's where we kind of start this story. So the last 12 miles is in the early days with a lot of small-time operators, but it's once money can be made off of something and people get a whiff of that, word spreads. So it also is taking place while the northern mobsters and Al Capone are figuring out a lot of money can be made, and they're sort of coming in. So it's during that transitional time when your independent operators, in some ways, they were almost funny in the ways they outran the law or tried to, are becoming serious operations. And with that, organized crime is organizing. So it's getting much more deadly.
So tell us about Elizabeth. How did she get involved with trying to catch these rum runners?
It was so interesting how she and her husband began. She was at her wit's end. She'd borrowed money for college from her father, who charged her a lot of interest because he didn't think women should go to college. She was having a hard time paying him back and finally went to go look for a job in the big city of Chicago and was forlorn. Nobody wanted her. And she ended up at the Shakespeare Library, and a librarian said, I know somebody who's working on a Shakespeare project. Connects Elizabeth with basically a madman who runs a think tank. And off she goes to this think tank. And it's there that she meets William Friedman, who later becomes her husband. And what she's doing there is looking at Shakespearean texts, at the letters, trying to see if there's a code that will reveal Francis Bacon wrote it. And William, he'll take pictures, he enlarges them for the people working on that project. Well, what's happening during the time is that she's really learning to see patterns and look at nuances and small changes in character and letter. And he's also working on this. And then eventually they become kind of good at it. And they don't believe that Francis Bacon wrote Shakespeare. They believe Shakespeare wrote Shakespeare. But they get involved during the Great War with training code breakers, because this is happening in overseas. Germans are starting to send and break and make code. And the two of them get involved. And when they get married, they actually end up training the very first code breakers of the United States military during the Great War. William ends up going overseas and their paths diverge and come back and diverge and come back. But so it's during the time after the war that she's involved in. The Coast Guard actually wants to hire William, but the Army already has him. And so they hire Elizabeth as their second choice. And she ends up doing a wonderful job.
So tell us about the story here. You have these two women on opposite sides of the law in 1926.
It happened very much the way my research did. So I found Elizabeth, and I found out during World War II she had nabbed a female American, but an Axis spy. And I thought, oh, it would make such a good book to have two women on two sides of the law. And, ask and you shall receive. As I'm going through the Coast Guard files, the National Archives, as Elizabeth might have in some of the files she worked with, I found a man named Charles Waite. And he was a really, really notorious man. He became known as the king of the rum runners. I found newspaper clippings of him, and he has sort of this devilish look in his eye. You can just tell he's trouble. And all of a sudden, I'm looking at the newspaper clippings, and I started to get captivated by Mrs. C.W. Waite. And I started digging into her, and then I found out that she became quite the notorious rum runner herself, and involved in things that maybe even made Charles blush. So she captivated my interest, and she became the antagonist.
I'm talking with Erika Robuck about The Last 12 Miles, and our conversation continues in a moment. If you're enjoying this discussion, please subscribe, like, and click on the bell so you'll know when I post new interviews. And thank you. So tell us a bit about the research you had to do, because it sounds like you had a lot of information about Elizabeth, but the lady who became known as Spanish Marie, the details are not so clear.
Yes. I mean, both women were really good at their jobs, and part of that is staying under the radar. I'm able to get more about Elizabeth because of the Freedom of Information Act, the Internet Archive. She worked so long ago, a lot of her files are declassified, though not all of them. And there are a number of nice biographies that really detail her whole life really well. Marie Waite, on the other hand, was a bit of a nightmare to track down. One of the best resources I found for her was newspapers.com. And I started digging through. She liked notoriety. And a lot of these rum runners down in South Florida liked being in the paper. So they would be in the people thought of this as sort of a Robin Hood game where the rum runners were like the Robin Hood and the feds were the bad guys. And they became micro celebrities. So I was able to find a bit of a paper trail that way with her, and then just use that crossing references with National Archives documents and things. What I couldn't find, I made up. That's the beauty of historical fiction. So some of it, I even, write a sort of apology for the crimes against history I may or may not have committed. But that is why I write fiction. I can have a little fun in there.
I understand that is the challenge for someone who writes historical fiction, because you can do all this research and there's so much you could put in the book, but you have to maintain this narrative between the facts and the fiction you need to drive that narrative.
Yes, that's always the challenge, is taking history. And again, I'm not a biographer, so I'm not trying to write a linear story. I'm trying to write a novel where the characters experience challenges that change them, and then find climaxes. So it does sometimes involve a little bit of flexibility of the timeline. But usually if I have to do that, I make a note of it. Usually if I ask history, it delivers. And this one, it really did in spades. Like, I couldn't have made up some of the more colorful characters and stories and situations. The truth is always stranger than fiction, and I enjoy finding those anecdotes.
So what were some of the things that surprised you the most as you were doing your research?
Well, when I was in the Coast Guard files, the National Archives, I take out an old newspaper and there's a little baby sitting there smiling, and it's Baby Betty is the rum runner's baby, and there's no cursing when she's aboard. She plays with empty bottles. And then there was another rum runner who lost his glass eyeball, and Elizabeth intercepted the message and had a good laugh over that. There's stories of an arm falling out of a cut open shark. And then they took the prints of the arm, and it was someone whose prints they had on file because he was a bootlegger. So it was just crazy, the things that I found. And all of them, if the weirder it sounds, if it's in the book, the truer it probably is.
Besides being an engaging story, what is it you hope people will take away from learning about these two women?
Well, one of the things, women, everyone fascinates me. And when you put two women as almost foils for one another, it really draws out character. I love doing this. I've done it in two other books, and it's one of my favorite things to write now. And one of the things I've discovered is that nobody is simply bad or simply good. My protagonist is not perfect. My antagonist is not evil. They have things about them, and they have motivations and pasts and histories. And one of the things in this book that was interesting to me is that I felt a little bit like they crisscrossed. I mean, certainly the rum runner never becomes a good guy, but she becomes more sympathetic, I would say. So I enjoy making that journey and revealing people as they are, which is far more complex than just a bad guy and a good guy.
And these are both women that, for their times, really took things into their own hands. And when men would normally say, no, you just step to the side, they came forward and performed quite well. And Spanish Marie, she had a husband who gambled. Mm-hmm. And she would say, I would make strides forward, but then he would knock us back. So she felt like she needed to be the sort of the breadwinner for the family and keep things going.
Yeah, and I had some insight into that. My maternal grandmother had a really bad marriage and a really bad husband who was quite a scoundrel. So I was able to draw on some of the ways that she tried to provide for her family. I think she would get a kick out of being compared to the villain. And she had such a colorful personality. So I had a little insight into that. I enjoy drawing those people to life and revealing those in history. And the more women I looked for, the more I found. So the assistant DA down in Miami was a woman. Not only was she a woman, she was a pilot. So I was able to bring that into the story. And then for the Attorney General for the whole United States, the assistant was a woman. So you have all of these different interesting women, another code breaker, Agnes Meyer Driscoll. They all have cameos in the book. And so it makes for interesting reading for a time I think a lot of people don't know a lot about.
Erika, there's a question that I like to ask authors of fiction, and it's this. If you could spend a day in real life with one of the characters in your novel, who would it be and why?
Well, without question, I would want to be on board a Coast Guard cutter with Elizabeth Friedman trying to hunt down Marie Waite. I live just outside of Annapolis, Maryland, and I spend all summer on power boats. And I've even had my husband do some high racing scenes so I could take video footage to use as background for Instagram reels. And my grandfather was in the Navy. I've just always grown up on boats and around the military, the Naval Academy. And I just love it. I get such a kick out of it. And the idea of a chase on the high seas, there's nothing I'd want more.
Yeah,
maybe a cocktail at the end.
You've touched on this a bit, but you're known obviously for writing historical fiction. What is it you enjoy about this genre?
I love research. I love the amateur detective work. I love going to an archive and finding a name and then looking at a newspaper from 1926 and finding a cross-reference and putting those things together. It's basically like putting together a puzzle. And then once it's finished and I have the book, there's something really satisfying about that. So I enjoy the process so much.
Let's talk a bit about the title. What's the significance of The Last 12 Miles?
Sure. The waters off of the United States, there was a region that was considered American waters, which was 3 miles. And what would happen is it was such a short area that the rum runners would zip right through and get right to the beach before the Coast Guard could intercept them. And so the United States made contracts and treaties with dozens and dozens of countries, expanding our water borders to 12 miles. So the Coast Guard had more of a way to catch the rum runners before they made it ashore. That sounded like a great idea, but it wasn't a good idea because the area they had to patrol expanded exponentially, and they didn't have enough watercraft to do it. So then that helped actually grow the Coast Guard into the force that it is today. And these channels that opened up to smuggle illegal alcohol have become drug smuggling, have become human trafficking. We're still chasing this down with the way it opened up during Prohibition. So with the last 12 miles also, it's reminiscent of finishing something and coming to the end of it, the area that has to be raced across. There's a lot of meaning to it. So
what's next for you?
So I'm working on another woman from the shadows of history that probably never heard of, but she's sort of like the Forrest Gump of the 50s and 60s. She was absolutely everywhere, involved in everything, and I can't wait to reveal who she is, but I cannot yet do that.
Well, this book is The Last 12 Miles by Erika Robuck. Erika, thank you for talking with me today.
Thank you. I enjoyed it.
Now, if you'd like to purchase The Last 12 Miles, I've placed a link for you in the description below. And if you'd like to see more videos about books and their authors on a wide variety of topics, be sure to subscribe, like, and click on the bell to be notified about future programs. I'm Dan Skinner. Thank you for watching this edition of Some Books Considered.